Delivered as part of the 1955 Modernization plan, the Sulzer Type 4 Peaks, a series of 3 individual classes of diesel locomotives, would become one of the most notable fixtures of the British railway network for the next 30 years, and throughout their careers would help to revive the fortunes of the ailing Midland Mainline, turning what was once a backwater railway to the north into a vital commuter corridor between the East Midlands and London. The story of the Peaks, later known as the Class 44, 45 and 46, is owed to the Midland Mainline, one of 4 routes north out of London to the Midlands and Scotland, with the Midland Mainline running from the famous London St Pancras station to Leicester, Loughborough, Derby, Nottingham, Sheffield and Leeds, but due to its winding profile, was never able to attain the high speeds enjoyed by the rival West and East Coast main lines. In 1948, the former operator of the Midland and West Coast main lines, the London Midland and Scottish Railway, or LMS, was nationalised by the Attlee government to form the Midland region of British Railways, with the Midland Main Line, endemic of its somewhat lower priority status when compared to the West Coast Main Line, boasting a motive power roster comprised mainly of secondary passenger and mixed traffic engines, including Fowler Class 4Ps, LMS Ivett Class 4s, and LMS Stanier Class 5 460s. In 1955, British Railways drafted the Modernization plan, a radical development scheme which would see the replacement of thousands of steam engines with a slew of brand new diesel and electric locomotives, combined with a rolling electrification scheme on a majority of Britain's main lines. However, the plan, despite being a unified effort by British Railways to introduce locomotives that were, ostensibly, available for use on all regions, ended with most of the classes built being dictated by the requirements or demands of individual regions, an example being the Western region, which stubbornly considered itself a continuation of the famous Great Western Railway, and defiantly adopted a policy of diesel hydraulic transmission only, resulting in the famous Class 42 warships and 52 Westerns. While the aforementioned diesel hydraulic transmission provided lighter and faster locomotives as opposed to the comparatively lumbering diesel-electric traction, it was generally the policy of British Railways to consider diesel-electric, with the Derby Works being commissioned to develop a new series of prospective diesel locomotives for the Midland Main Line under the Modernization plan. For power, BR turned to the Swiss engine manufacturer Sulzer to develop the locomotive's prime mover, with the company's then frontline locomotive engine design being the LDA series, which began production in around 1938, but had seen successful use in the French SNCF Class CC 65-500 and the Romanian Railway CFR Class 60, the LDA series, which consisted of a single-bank 8-cylinder engine, being considered suitable for the upcoming British diesel. Initially, the Sulzer LDA 31 engines used by the SNCF and Romanian locomotives were found to be too large to fit inside a British locomotive due to the restrictive loading gauge of the UK network, and thus Sulzer was forced to develop a scaled-down variant dubbed the LDA 28, though despite this reduction in size, the engine was still comparatively large, especially when coupled to the Crompton-Parkinson GC426-A1 main generator. As a result of the power plant's weight, the body and chassis required significant framing and support, in addition to the engine and its auxiliary equipment, train heating boilers, water and fuel. The tremendous load, which eventually came to 135 tons, meaning that the original plan to have the locomotive be of a 2-axle configuration was increased to 4, presenting a 16-wheel arrangement to carry its heavy internal working. The significant weight of the locomotive was a somewhat crippling factor in the engine's route availability, and thus it could only be restricted to certain sections of the main line where the track could suitably support the Titanic machine, with work commencing on the production of the first 4 prototypes of what was now dubbed the Sulzer Type 4 during 1958, with completion of this initial batch set for the summer of 1959. The pilot locomotive, D1, began tests during June 1959 around the Derby area, though at this early stage, little is known as to whether any initial teething issues needed to be addressed, while on July 14th of the same year, the engine made its formal debut at Carlisle Station, where it was christened the name Scaffold Pike, the highest mountain in England, by Sir Fergus Graham, Lord Lieutenant of Cumberland, thus forming the origin of the locomotive's nickname of Peaks. After continued testing, D1 officially entered service on September 5, 1959, being allocated to Camden Motor Power Depot in North London, though due to the locomotive being slated for use on the Midland Main Line, and with Camden Shed being situated on the West Coast Main Line, D1, along with its other classmates, would instead be loaned to Derby Shed for more convenience, the initial batch being for 10 locomotives, with the last, D10, being delivered to Camden Shed on February 20, 1960. Operations for the Sulzer Type 4s, later designated Class 44 under the TOP system, were unusually split between London Euston and London St Pancras stations, but their use saw them employed on top expresses along the Midland Mainline to Leicester, Derby, Nottingham and Sheffield, as well as the early morning service from the former Midland Railway terminus at Manchester Central to London St Pancras, returning on a mid-afternoon train. Early in their careers, though, the Class 44s would suffer a series of teething problems, including bogie frame fractures, issues with the vacuum exhausters and auxiliary motor, inadequate batteries that were prone to rapid exhaustion, and fractures in the water tanks for the steam heating boilers, the exhausters being particularly troublesome, as due to their positioning in the centre of the engine room, replacement of these units required lifting through the roof via a crane, a delicate process that took up to 8 to 12 hours. Nevertheless, the Class 44s, aside from their initial teething problems, illustrated a significant improvement in performance when compared to the preceding steam engines, and the Derby works were thus commissioned again to begin development on what would essentially be the production series of locomotives, with 127 units being ordered for what would later become the Class 45, with BR's works at Crewe also being commissioned to deliver the fleet due to capacity constraints at Derby. The resultant Class 45s were virtually identical to the Class 44, but featured an increase in power output from the marine-type, slow-revving Sulzer 12 LDA 28B diesel engine, which produced 2,500 horsepower as opposed to the early 2,300 horsepower output, meaning the Class 45s were capable of reaching a top speed of 90 miles an hour as opposed to the Class 44's 75 miles an hour, as well as featuring improved acceleration. The first Class 45s entered service on the Midland region in late 1960, and were immediately put to work on a variety of Midland and West Coast express trains, becoming the prime motive power for services out of London St Pancras, and thus demoting steam on this route to either humdrum freight operations or the scrapyard, while on the West Coast, these locomotives worked a variety of Anglo-Scottish services, replacing the famous Stenier Pacifics of the LMS. The final variant of the peak locomotives followed in 1961, with the Derby works being commissioned again to deliver an updated version of the Class 45 with a myriad of mechanical modifications, with the body shell and Sulzer engine remaining unchanged, while upgraded generator and traction motors were developed by the Loughborough-based Brush Company to replace the previous Crompton-Parkinson equipment fitted to the Class 45s. Designated Class 46, this new fleet of locomotives and their revised mechanics differed very little from the preceding Class 45, being still rated at 2,500 horsepower and maintaining a top speed of 90 miles an hour, thus leading to the production run of these engines, based on the minor number of changes from the preceding class, being curtailed at only 56 units, becoming the last of the peak class to be built in 1963. With a fleet of 183 superior Class 45s and 46s now in service, the small company of 10 Class 44s were quickly considered non-standard by the management, and with more than enough of their brethren to cover their presence on passenger workings, these pilot units began trials as freight locomotives from June 1960, with D8 being tested in conjunction with BR Standard 9F number 92153 on coal trains out of Towton near Nottingham. In 1962, the class underwent major modifications to remove their steam heating boilers, and their engines were retrofitted with supercharged air coolers to bring their total power output to 2,500 horsepower, while in May of the same year, the entire Class 44 fleet was allocated to Towton, and, in conjunction with 5 brand new Class 46s, took over on the Witchner and Washwood Heath freights, these engines spending the rest of their working lives at Towton hauling coal trains, with their range only dictated by the route knowledge of allocated drivers. As for Class 45s and 46s, with the gradual electrification of the West Coast Main Line between London, Euston, Crewe, Manchester and Liverpool from 1959 to 1965, peak power on these express services were gradually curtailed to the northern sections of the route as Class 81s to 86s took over, and they could often be observed working expresses from Crewe and Manchester to Edinburgh and Glasgow via Carlisle, as well as supplementing the Trans-Pennine Express service between Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, York and Hull. By 1970, however, a majority of peak duties on trains north of the border had been put into the hands of double-headed Class 50 locomotives, which had been purpose-built to operate Anglo-Scottish expresses between Crewe and Glasgow, though of note during this period was the minor celebrity role of Class 45 D60 Lytham St Anne's, as it hauled the final through passenger train on the famous Waverley route between Edinburgh and Carlisle via Hoyk. The class were also regular performers on the cross-country network between Leeds, Sheffield, Derby, Birmingham, Bristol, Exeter and Plymouth, working long-distance summertime express services to the resorts of Devon and Cornwall, though initially, the divisions of each region meant that when peak locomotives, which were allocated to the Midland region, arrived at Bristol Temple Meads, as the first station on the Western region, these engines had to be swapped to one that was allocated to the region it was about to enter and vice versa. However, by the 1970s, this rule was somewhat relaxed, and Class 45s and 46s could often be seen working trains along the sea wall at Dawlish and Teignmouth on their way to Paignton, Plymouth, Newquay and Penzance, while back on the Midland Mainline itself, the peaks were truly the power of this route, but were also the face of its somewhat neglected state by the middle of the 1970s. While British Rail had unsuccessfully proposed the closure of London St Pancras and the rerouting of Midland trains into King's Cross during the 1960s, by the following decade the Midland Main Line was truly Britain's forgotten trunk railway, with attempts to improve speed across the network being focused more on the west and east coast main lines, while the route through Leicester, Derby, Nottingham and Sheffield continued to use a deteriorating network of points, signals and track work that dated back to the end of the Victorian era. Following the July 1968 cessation of direct services between London St Pancras and Manchester Central, the Midland Main Line essentially comprised a single primary route through the East Midlands and Derby Dales, though despite this, the Class 45s and 46s proved to be strong and dependable stalwarts on the few remaining passenger operations, but with continuing service cutbacks, it became inevitable that spare units would be relegated to the bread-and-butter work of freight. Class 46s were especially prone to freight work, with a small fleet based in Cornwall for use on the China Clay traffic around Lostwithiel and Parr, while aside from their Midland engagements, the remainder of the class were stretched across the heart of England from Gateshead in the north to Bristol and Plymouth in the southwest. In November 1980, the last of the Class 44s were withdrawn after 21 years of service, having been replaced by a new fleet of Class 47s and 56s on their various freight duties, while Class 45 and 46 operations, aside from several units written off due to accident damage, remained primarily intact for the former, while the latter also faced the end of its service life due to the non-standard nature of its 56-strong fleet. From 1980 to 1983, most of the Class 46s were retired as the influx of more standard diesel locomotives, such as Class 47s, started making inroads into their fleet on both passenger and freight workings, with 38 examples being withdrawn and scrapped in 1980 alone, their retirement schedule being increased from May 1983 by the arrival of the Class 43s and their Intercity 125 sets on services between London St Pancras and the East Midlands. While the HST's 125-mile-an-hour performance was largely curbed by the poor condition of the Midland Main Line's track work and signalling, the benefits of removing loco-hauled operation from top-line expresses was immediately apparent, the HSTs, by comparison, being smooth, fast, easier to operate and maintain, and far more reliable than the increasingly decrepit fleet of peak-class locomotives. Thus, mass withdrawals for Class 45s also began alongside the Class 46s, with the latter bowing out in 1984, as the last 7 members were removed from use during November of that year, though this wasn't before the spectacular demise of 46009 in July 1984 at the hands of the Central Electricity Generating Board, or CEGB. After its withdrawal in October 1983, having worked a career of 22 years on expresses out of London St Pancras, 46009 was handed over to the BR Research Department under number 97401 in November of that year, being allocated to Toton and sidelined for use in an upcoming crash test for the new flat-roll DB550019 nuclear flask. On July 17, 1984, the locomotive and 3 Mark I coaches was allowed to run away on the Old Dalby test track, reaching a speed of 90 miles an hour as it hurtled uncontrollably through the Leicestershire countryside, headed straight towards a flat-roll nuclear flask that had been positioned across the track, the flask having been filled with water to replicate radioactive material. Nearing its top speed, the train rounded the curve at the site of the former Old Dalby train station and smacked head-on into the flask, causing the Class 46 to explode in a massive ball of flames and smoke, destroying the locomotive and coaches, but merely denting and scorching the nuclear flask with no leaks reported, although atomic energy critics disputed that the test was far too staged to truly simulate the effects of such an incident. With the Class 45s now the sole remaining members of the peak classes left operating, these, surprisingly, continued to persevere throughout the decade, as while HSTs had been introduced on the cross-country route in 1982, it wasn't uncommon to find peaks working the line on secondary expresses as late as 1988, with the removal of their long-outdated steam heating boilers in favour of electric train heating, helping to earn the class a reprieve in a support role. On other secondary routes, including Transpennine Express services along the North Wales coastline, the Class 45 survived until 1985, while the bulk of peak-haul TPE trains on the core route between Newcastle and Liverpool continued until 1987, after which Class 47s dominated the loco-hauled operations on this line. In their final years, peaks saw increasing relegation to freight operations, with these locomotives frequently seen on intermodal and mixed traffic workings on the Midland and West Coast main lines, with the end for the class eventually coming in February 1989, when 45106 Vulcan, the last active unit to see work into 1989, was allocated to work a farewell rail tour, but caught fire while working the 0712 Derby to London St Pancras on February 3rd, 1989, thus seeing 45128 Centaur, which had been withdrawn in August 1988, reinstated to work the tour instead. Fortunately, due to the length of time taken to dispose of the fleet, with some examples rotting in scrapyards until as late as 1994, a brief window of opportunity was garnered to preserve a few members of the fleet, with a total of 2 Class 44s, 11 Class 45s, and 3 Class 46s being saved from the cutter's torch. Overall, the Class 44, 45, and 46 peak locomotives are among the few Modernization Plan-era diesel locomotives that proved to be fairly successful machines, helping to keep the decaying Midland Mainline alive for over 20 years before the influence of the HSTs came to reverse its fortunes, despite the fact that their weight issues meant the ability to distribute these machines further afield was severely limited. Nevertheless, the class proved, against all adversity, that they could easily and dutifully power express passenger and freight operations, truly cementing themselves as the workhorses of the Midland region.